A single choice, forged in the heat of a stranger's terror, was about to rewrite her entire world in chrome and leather. The bell above the diner door chimed a cheerful, oblivious tune, a stark contrast to the knot of ice forming in Isla's stomach. She'd only stopped for coffee, a brief respite from the endless gray of a Tuesday afternoon. The man who sat 2 stools down was a mountain of leather and denim, his back a canvas of intricate patches she couldn't quite read. He nursed his own black coffee, his presence a silent, gravitational force in the otherwise quiet room. Trouble didn't walk in, it materialized. It came in the form of 2 men, their suits too sharp, their smiles too thin. They moved with a predatory grace that set every nerve in Isla's body screaming. They flanked the leather-clad man, their voices low and menacing, words like debt and consequence slithering through the air. Isla tried to look away, to shrink into her worn copy of Moby Dick, but her eyes kept snagging on the reflection in the polished chrome of the napkin dispenser. She saw the subtle shift, the glint of metal as one of the suits reached inside his jacket. Time seemed to warp, stretching and thinning like molten glass. The biker, whose name she would later learn was Ryker Raze Vance, hadn't seen it. He was looking at the other man, his jaw set like granite. But Isla saw it. She saw the gun, the cold, black eye of it clearing the holster. She saw the man's thumb flick the safety off. In that fractured second, her life, a quiet stream of library books and watercolor paintings, crashed against a brutal, jagged reality. There was no thought, only a primal, unbidden instinct to act. She wasn't a hero. She was a 24-year-old artist who got nervous ordering pizza over the phone. But in that moment, something else took over. As the suit's arm rose, Isla launched herself off the stool. The world became a blur of motion and sound. The scent of burnt coffee, the shattering of her ceramic mug on the floor, the biker's startled grunt of surprise. She slammed into his side, a clumsy, desperate shove meant to push him out of the line of fire. The roar of the gunshot was deafening, a physical blow that seemed to suck all the air from the room. It was followed by a sensation she'd never imagined, a white-hot, searing pain that blossomed in her shoulder. It wasn't like the movies. It was a vicious, tearing fire that stole her breath and buckled her knees. She collapsed against the biker, her head hitting his leather-clad chest. His arms, strong as steel bands, wrapped around her reflexively. She heard him roar, a sound of pure, untamed fury that was more terrifying than the gunshot itself. The world tilted, her vision swimming in and out of focus. She saw the 2 suits backing away, their slick confidence shattered, replaced by panic. The mountain of man she had saved was now a shield in front of her, his own weapon now in his hand, a chrome beast that spat fire and thunder. The scene dissolved into chaos, shouts, the crash of tables, the smell of cordite. Isla's last conscious thought was of the biker's eyes, a startling, intense blue, filled not with gratitude, but with a horrifying, protective rage. Then the world went dark, the only sensation the feeling of being held, a fortress against the storm she had unwittingly unleashed. The pain was a living thing, a predator with claws sunk deep into her flesh. Isla drifted on a gray ocean of morphine, punctuated by sharp, jagged islands of agony. Fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous dirge above her, the sterile scent of antiseptic clinging to everything. She blinked, her vision slowly clearing to the pale green walls of a hospital room. A plastic tube snaked into her arm, and a rhythmic beeping from a machine beside her bed kept time with the throbbing in her shoulder. A memory, fragmented and violent, flashed behind her eyes. The diner, the glint of a gun, the explosion of pain. She had pushed him, the biker, the stranger. A groan escaped her lips as she tried to shift, the fire in her shoulder flaring into a supernova. "Easy there," a nurse said, her voice soft but firm. "You're at St. Michael's, General. You were shot. You're very lucky the bullet went clean through lucky." The word felt hollow, absurd. She remembered the biker's face, the rage in his eyes. Was he okay? What had happened after she passed out? Two detectives came to visit later that afternoon. They were tired, their suits rumpled, their questions clinical and detached. They smelled of stale coffee and cynicism. Isla Hayes, one of them asked, flipping open a small notebook. "We need to ask you a few questions about the incident at the diner." They wanted to know what she saw, what she heard. They used words like altercation and persons of interest. They refer to the biker as an uncooperative witness and the shooters as unknown assailants. Isla answered in a weak, raspy voice, the story feeling like a dream she was struggling to recall. As she spoke, she felt a growing sense of dread. The detectives' expressions never changed. They weren't looking for justice. They were filling out a report. "This seems like a rivalry dispute," the older one, Detective Miller, said with a sigh, snapping his notebook shut. "The man you helped, Ryker Vance. He's the president of the Hells Angels, Brothers of Retribution chapter. These things happen in his world. Our advice? Forget you saw anything. You did a brave thing, but getting involved with his kind, it's not worth it." They left her with a pamphlet on victim support services and a chilling sense of abandonment. She wasn't a hero. She was a loose end, a civilian caught in the crossfire of a war she didn't understand. The police weren't going to protect her. They saw her as a complication in a file they wanted to close. Fear, cold and sharp, began to seep into the morphine haze. The men who shot her were still out there. They knew she was a witness. They knew she had saved their target. The hospital room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its large window a gaping vulnerability. That night, sleep offered no escape. Every shadow that danced on the wall became a figure. Every noise in the hallway, a footstep approaching her door. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. When the sun rose the next morning, casting long, pale fingers of light across her room, it brought no comfort. Just the promise of another day spent waiting for a threat she couldn't see, a threat the law had already dismissed. But the morning brought something else. It started as a low, distant vibration, a faint tremor she felt in the floorboards. It grew steadily, a deep, guttural hum that vibrated in her bones, rising into a thunderous, earth-shaking roar. It wasn't one engine, it was dozens. 100. More. Isla pushed the button to raise the head of her bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She winced against the pain and shuffled to the edge of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold linoleum floor. Holding her forestand for support, she limped to the window and peered down at the street 4 stories below. Her breath hitched in her throat. The sight was surreal, a vision from fever dream. The entire street in front of the hospital was gone, swallowed by a sea of chrome and steel. Harley-Davidsons, parked in perfect, menacing rows, lined both sides of the road for blocks. And standing beside them, or sitting on their bikes, were men, 150 of them, maybe more. They were clad in leather vests, their backs adorned with the same terrifying emblem of a winged skull. Hell's Angels. They weren't protesting. They weren't causing a disturbance. They were just there, a silent, unmoving army of leather and ink. Some smoked cigarettes, their faces grim. Others stared up at the hospital, their expressions unreadable. They formed a veritable fortress around the entrance, their presence a silent, powerful declaration. The police were there, a few cruisers parked at a distance, their occupants watching but doing nothing. The bikers owned the street. Isla's fear was suddenly replaced by a wave of disbelief and awe. This was for her. This intimidating, terrifying display of force was because of her. They weren't there to threaten her. They were there to protect her. A knock on her door made her jump. A nurse peeked in, her eyes wide. "Miss Hayes? You have a visitor." The door opened wider, and the man from the diner filled the frame. Ryker Raze Vance. Up close, he was even more imposing. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face a rugged landscape of hard lines and a neatly trimmed beard. A faded scar cut through his left eyebrow. His intense blue eyes, the ones she remembered from the diner, were fixed on her, stripped of their rage and filled with a raw, unnerving emotion she couldn't name. He held a small, slightly crushed bouquet of wildflowers in one massive, tattooed hand, looking utterly out of place. "They didn't have a vase," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He stepped into the room, his presence shrinking the space to nothing. He moved with a quiet confidence that was more intimidating than any overt threat. He placed the flowers awkwardly on her bedside table. "I'm Raze," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I never got to thank you." Isla just stared, her mind struggling to connect this quiet, intense man with the furious warrior from the diner and the army waiting outside. "Why are they here?" she whispered, gesturing toward the window. Raze followed her gaze. A flicker of something, pride perhaps, crossed his face. "In our world," he began, turning back to her, "debts are paid. Always. You took a bullet meant for me. That makes you our responsibility. No one is going to touch you. Ever again. That's not a request. It's a promise." The weight of his words settled over her, a shield heavier and more real than any police report. The fear that had held her captive for 24 hours began to recede, replaced by something new, something wild and uncertain. She had fallen into a world she never knew existed, and its king had just sworn fealty to her. The Hells Angels clubhouse was a world away from the sterile quiet of the hospital. It was a converted warehouse in the industrial part of town, a fortress of brick and corrugated steel. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old leather, stale beer, and motor oil. The main room was a cavernous space filled with a long, scarred wooden bar, pool tables, and mismatched couches. The walls were covered in photos, plaques, and the fading flags of past road trips. This was the nerve center of the Brothers of Retribution, and tonight, it was a war room. Ray stood before a large whiteboard, a map of the city tacked to it. His chapter surrounded him, a council of giants in worn leather. There was Jax Wrench, Riley, his sergeant-at-arms, a wiry man with clever eyes and grease permanently stained under his fingernails. There was Grizz, the massive enforcer whose fists were the size of cinder blocks, and Preacher, the club's treasurer, a surprisingly calm and methodical man who tracked their finances with the precision of an accountant. "Silas Croft," Ray said, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. He tapped a mugshot pin to the board. The man in the photo was unremarkable with cold, empty eyes. "They call him the Ghost because he's good at disappearing after a job. He's a freelancer, takes contract from the highest bidder. This time, it was the Scorpions." A low growl rumbled through the assembled men. The Scorpions were a rival club, known for dealing in narcotics and trafficking, everything the Brothers of Retribution stood against. Their code, while brutal, was clear. They policed their own, punished those who preyed on the weak, and never, ever involved civilians. Silas Croft had broken that last rule in the worst way possible. He targeted me in a public place. He put a civilian in the hospital. Raze continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. He put her in the hospital, his gaze swept over his men. This isn't just about the Scorpions anymore. This is about Silas. He crossed a line that doesn't get uncrossed. He left a witness. He knows she can identify his shooter. He will not let that stand. As he spoke, an image flashed in his mind, unbidden and unwelcome. It wasn't Isla in that hospital bed, but his younger sister, Sarah. Years ago, she had witnessed a crime committed by a man with similar connections. She had trusted the police. She had trusted the system, and the system had failed her. The witness protection program was a joke. They found her. Raze had been younger then, just a prospect in the club, powerless. The memory of her frightened face, the sound of his mother's weeping, it was the fuel that had forged him into the man he was today. He had buried that pain deep, transforming it into a cold, hard resolve. He would not fail again. He would not let another innocent person pay the price for his war. "Wrench," Raze said, his focus snapping back to the present. "I want everything you can find on Silas. His habits, his hideouts, his associates. Tear this city apart. Grizz, I want teams on the hospital. Round the clock. Nobody gets near Isla's floor without our say-so. We're locking that place down tighter than a drum." Wrench nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I got contacts who owe me favors. They hear everything on the street. If Silas breathes, I'll know what brand of toothpaste he used. A bit of dark humor cut through the tension, but the smiles it elicited were grim. He underestimated us, Raze said, his eyes scanning the faces of his brothers. He saw one of us, alone, and thought we were weak. He's about to learn what happens when you attack one of us. You get all of us. The men slammed their fists on the tables, a thunderous chorus of agreement. It was more than a plan. It was a blood oath. They would move with a speed and efficiency the police couldn't hope to match. They would use their own network, their own brand of justice. For Raze, this was more than just revenge. It was a chance at redemption, a way to silence the ghosts of his past by protecting the future of a woman who had, for a reason he couldn't fathom, saved his life. He owed her a debt that could only be paid in blood and gasoline, and the entire chapter was ready to help him collect. Silas Croft prided himself on his professionalism. He was a creature of logic and control, an artist whose medium was violence. Emotion was a liability, a flaw in the system. But as he looked at the report from his informant, a rare flicker of annoyance disturbed his cold composure. The job should have been simple. Eliminate the president of the Hells Angels, collect his fee, and disappear. But it had been compromised, not by the target, who had been predictably tough, but by a ghost, a variable he hadn't accounted for, a civilian girl with a hero complex. Now, the girl, Isla Hayes, was a problem. She was a witness. She had seen his man's face. In his world, loose ends were snipped with brutal finality. He sat in the sterile quiet of a high-end apartment he used as a temporary base, the city lights glittering like a carpet of cold diamonds below. He despised messiness, and this situation was becoming exceedingly messy. The news reports were calling her a hero. Worse, his sources confirmed the Hells Angels had turned the hospital into a fortress. It was a theatrical, brutish display that offended his sense of surgical precision. "They're sentimental fools," he muttered to the empty room. He picked up a burner phone and dialed a number. The man who answered was named Petrov, a low-level enforcer with more muscle than brains, but useful for simple, unpleasant tasks. "There's a girl at St. Michael's General," Silas said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Room 412. Isla. She's the witness from the diner. The bikers are all over that place," Petrov grunted. "I know," Silas replied calmly. "They are expecting a frontal assault. They are expecting a threat they can see and punch. You will not be that. You will be a delivery man, a hospital orderly, a grieving relative visiting his sick aunt. You will find a way to get to her room. You are not to harm her yet. Just deliver a message. Let her know that her brave act has consequences. Let her know that hospital walls and a pack of rabid dogs can't protect her forever. I want her afraid. Fear is a more effective weapon than any bullet." He hung up before Petrov could reply. This was a test, a way to gauge the Angels' response, to see how organized their protection truly was. If Petrov succeeded, the girl's fear would make her a less credible witness. If he failed, well, men like Petrov were expendable assets. Back at the hospital, the atmosphere on the fourth floor had transformed. The bikers weren't inside, but their presence was felt everywhere. Two burly, leather-clad men stood at the end of the hallway by the elevators, arms crossed, their polite but unyielding demeanor stopping anyone who didn't have a reason to be there. Grizz was coordinating them from a black van parked across the street, a hub of surveillance feeds and communications. He watched the hospital's main entrance, the service corridors, the fire escapes. Inside, Isla was starting to feel a surreal sense of safety. The constant roar of engines from below was a strange, comforting lullaby. But the fear still lingered, a cold shadow in the corner of her room. The arrival of Petrov was subtle. He came dressed as a flower delivery man, holding a large, ostentatious bouquet of lilies. He was a big man, but he hunched his shoulders, making himself seem smaller, harmless. The nurse at the station waved him through with a smile. The two bikers at the elevator gave him a hard look, but a flower delivery wasn't on their list of threats to intercept. They let him pass, but their eyes followed him down the hall. Petrov's heart hammered in his chest. This was easier than he thought. He reached room 412, his hand closing around the small, sharp blade hidden in his pocket. Silas said not to harm her, but a small cut, a tangible threat, would be more effective than words. He pushed the door open slowly. Isla was sitting up in bed, sketching in a notepad, a look of intense concentration on her face. She looked up, startled, as he entered. "I have a delivery for Isla Raze," he said, forcing a cheerful tone. Her eyes widened, not at the flowers, but at his face. She recognized him, not from the diner, but from somewhere else. The way his eyes darted around the room, the coldness in them. This wasn't a delivery man. This was a predator. Before she could scream, a shadow fell over the doorway. One of the bikers, a man known as Tank, filled the frame, his expression one of bored curiosity. "Who sent the flowers?" he asked, his voice a casual rumble. Petrov froze. "A secret admirer," he stammered. Tank stepped into the room, his gaze flicking from Petrov to the lilies, then to Isla's terrified face. He saw it instantly. The flicker of panic in the delivery man's eyes, the way his hand was inching toward his pocket. "Lilies," Tank said thoughtfully, closing the door behind him. "You know, they usually send those for funerals." In that one sentence, the illusion shattered. Petrov knew he was caught. He lunged, not at Isla, but at the biker pulling the knife. The movement was clumsy, desperate. Tank moved with surprising speed for a man his size. He didn't even bother drawing a weapon. He simply stepped inside the arc of the knife and brought his elbow down hard on Petrov's forearm. A sickening crack echoed in the small room. The knife clattered to the floor. Petrov screamed, clutching his broken arm. The second biker was there in an instant. They hauled the whimpering man out of the room as if he were a sack of garbage. The whole confrontation over in less than 10 seconds. It was brutally, terrifyingly efficient. Isla sat frozen, the sketchbook falling from her lap. The message had been delivered, but not the one Silas intended. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was under the protection of an organization far more dangerous and effective than she could have ever imagined. And their war had just followed her into her hospital room. The aftermath of the attempted intimidation was swift and decisive. Within minutes, Petrov was gone, bundled into the back of an unmarked van and taken to a place where Wrench could have a long, persuasive conversation with him. Raze arrived at the hospital shortly after, his face a thunderous mask. He strode into Isla's room to find her pale and shaken, staring at the discarded lilies on the floor as if they were venomous snakes. He kicked them out of the way without a word. "You're not safe here," he stated, his voice tight with controlled fury. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a verdict. "They got a man this close. It won't happen again. We're moving you." Isla looked up at him, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "Moving me? Where? To another hospital?" "No," Raze said, his gaze locking with hers. "Someplace they won't think to look. Someplace they can't get to. You're coming with us." The idea was terrifying. Leaving the relative sanctuary of the hospital to go with a group of men she barely knew, men who lived by a code of violence she couldn't comprehend. But staying here, a sitting duck in a bed, was no longer an option. She had seen the coldness in the fake deliverman's eyes. She knew he wouldn't have stopped with just a message. She gave a small, trembling nod. The extraction was a masterpiece of biker logistics. While a few members created a minor, noisy disturbance at the main entrance, drawing the attention of hospital security and the lingering police, two others wheeled a gurney with a body-sized laundry cart into the service elevator. A nurse, whose brother was a member of a support club, looked the other way. Isla, dressed in a set of clothes they had brought for her, was quietly escorted down a back stairwell by Raze himself. His hand rested lightly on her lower back, a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. They emerged in the underground parking garage, the air cool and smelling of exhaust fumes. A black van, the same one Grizz had used for surveillance, was waiting, its engine idling. She was ushered inside, and the doors slid shut, plunging her into darkness. The van smelled of stale coffee and metal. As they pulled out into the city streets, Raze finally spoke, his voice softer now. "Our doctor will meet us at the clubhouse. He'll check your shoulder, Make sure you have everything you need. The clubhouse? Isla repeated, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. It's the safest place for you right now, he said simply. The journey was a blur of traffic lights and darkened streets. When they finally arrived, they pulled not up to the front of the imposing brick building, but around back, through a heavy steel gate that slid open to admit them and then shut with a heavy clang. She was home, or rather, she was in their home. The interior of the clubhouse was just as she'd imagined, yet somehow different. It was masculine and gritty, but there was a sense of order to the chaos. A younger member, a prospect, immediately began cleaning up discarded bottles. Another was polishing the chrome on his bike with meticulous care. This wasn't just a bar. It was a sanctuary, a church of leather and steel. They led her to a small, clean room upstairs that was usually reserved for visiting members from other chapters. It was Spartan, a bed, a dresser, small attached bathroom. But the door had a heavy lock, and the window looked out over a walled-in courtyard patrolled by two very large bikers and an even larger dog. The club doctor, a grizzled old man named Doc Pete, who had lost his medical license years ago, but still knew more about gunshot wounds than most ER surgeons, examined her shoulder with gentle, practiced hands. He changed the dressing and gave her a fresh supply of painkillers, his gruff demeanor softened by kind eyes. "You're a tough kid," he grunted. "The muscle will be sore for a while, but you'll heal up fine. Just don't go pushing any more bikers out of the way." For a bit later, sitting on the edge of the bed, the distant sounds of the club, laughter, the clack of pool balls, the low rumble of a tuned engine, filtering up through the floor, Isla felt a strange sense of calm. She was in the heart of the lion's den, surrounded by men the world considered monsters. Yet for the first time since the shooting, she felt completely, undeniably safe. This was their world, and they had welcomed her into it, not as a victim, but as one of their own to be protected at all costs. The hunt was on. While Isla recovered in the surprising tranquility of the clubhouse, the Brothers of Retribution unleashed the full force of their network. This was their city, and they knew its dark underbelly better than any police force. They knew the back alleys where secrets were traded, the grimy bars where informants drank, and the warehouses where men like Silas Croft conducted their business. Wrench orchestrated the operation from a corner of the clubhouse, a laptop open in front of him, a constantly ringing burner phone pressed to his ear. He was a spider at the center of a vast, invisible web. His first stop was a chop shop run by a greasy weasel named Skinny Dave, a man who owed Wrench for keeping him out of a messy situation involving a stolen shipment of motorcycle parts. Wrench didn't threaten. He didn't need to. He just sat across from Dave in his cluttered office, cleaning his nails with a wicked-looking knife, and asked about Silas Croft. Skinny Dave sweated, his eyes darting around nervously. "Look, Wrench, I don't know anything. That guy's a ghost, for real. Nobody knows where he holes up. Everybody knows something, Dave," Wrench said conversationally, not looking up from his knife. "And right now, my president is feeling very impatient. He's got a guest, you see, a nice young lady who got hurt because of this ghost. And we take that kind of thing very personally." The implication hung heavy in the air. Dave cracked. He didn't know where Silas was, but he knew one of his runners, a kid who moved money and messages for him. He gave Wrench a name and a location, a pool hall on the east side. The next scene was a blur of control violence. Grizz and Tank paid a visit to the pool hall. They didn't smash the place up. They simply walked in, and the entire room fell silent. They cornered the runner in the back room. The kid tried to get tough, but one look at Grizz's dead-eyed stare was enough to shatter his bravado. He gave them a drop point, a location where he was supposed to leave a package for Silas later that night. Raze led the stakeout himself, parked in an unassuming sedan a block away from the designated drop, a derelict loading dock by the river. They waited for hours, the silence in the car thick with anticipation. It was during these quiet moments that Raze's thoughts drifted. He thought of Isla, of her quiet strength, and the impossible bravery of her selfless act. She was everything the world he inhabited was not: gentle, innocent, pure, and that world had nearly crushed her. Protecting her had become an obsession, a crusade. Finally, a car pulled up. Not Silas, but another of his foot soldiers. The bikers moved in, a silent, coordinated swarm. They had the man surrounded before he even knew what was happening. This one was tougher. He spat at them, snarled threats. But he hadn't met Preacher. The club's treasurer, the quiet bookkeeper, had a unique method of interrogation. He didn't use his fists. He used a laptop. He sat the man down and, in a calm, level voice, began to list every bit of information he had dug up in the last 12 hours. His mother's address, his girlfriend's place of work, the school his little brother attended. He wasn't threatening them. He was just stating facts. The man's face went from defiant to ashen white. He understood. The Hell's Angels weren't just targeting him. They could dismantle his entire life without throwing a single punch. He broke, and he gave them what they wanted: the location of Silas Croft's primary safe house. It was a disused textile warehouse on the edge of the city, heavily fortified. Wrench got the final piece of the puzzle from Petrov, the man from the hospital. After a few hours of Wrench's persuasion, which involved a detailed explanation of what a ball-peen hammer could do to a kneecap, Petrov had not only confirmed the warehouse location, but had also given them the number of guards and their patrol schedules. The noose was tightening. Back at the clubhouse, Raze stood before the whiteboard again. This time, it was covered with a schematic of the warehouse. The hunt was over. The war was about to begin. The night air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of river water and industrial decay. The textile warehouse loomed ahead, a monolithic block of darkness against the bruised purple sky. Inside, Silas Croft was growing impatient. His network, usually a reliable source of information, had gone silent. The runner had missed his check-in. The man sent to the drop point was unreachable. It was a disquieting silence, the kind that precedes a storm. He stood by a grimy window, looking out at the deserted streets, a sense of unease crawling up his spine. He wasn't used to feeling uneasy. He was the ghost, the predator, not the prey. The attack came without warning. There was no roar of engines, no battle cry. The bikers had parked a quarter-mile away, approaching the warehouse on foot, moving like wraiths through the shadows. The first sign of trouble for Silas's men was when the perimeter guard's radio went silent. Then the second. Grizz and Tank moved with a brutal, silent efficiency, disabling the sentries with garrotes and heavy, club-like fists. They were soldiers, not street brawlers. Wrench, perched on the roof of an adjacent building with a high-powered rifle and a night vision scope, acted as the overwatch, feeding information into Raze's earpiece. 2 tangos, east entrance. One on the catwalk, second floor, inside the clubhouse. Isla couldn't sleep. She could feel the tension that had gripped the building before the men left. Preacher had stayed behind with a few prospects to guard the place, his calm demeanor doing little to soothe her anxiety. On a whim, she pulled out her laptop. She'd overheard the address of the warehouse. A quick search of city planning records and architectural archives, a skill she'd honed for her art projects, brought up the original blueprints for the building. She saw something the bikers might have missed: an old, sealed-off steam tunnel that connected to the warehouse's boiler room. It wasn't on any modern schematics. She frantically called Preacher, explaining what she had found. The information was relayed to Raze instantly. "Change of plan," Raze whispered into his comms. "Wrench, give us a distraction at the main loading bay. Grizz, you're with me. We're going in through the basement." Wrench smiled in the darkness. Distraction, coming right up. A moment later, the gas tank of a junk car parked near the loading bay erupted in a massive fireball, the explosion echoing through the industrial park. The blast drew most of Silas's guards toward the front, just as Raze and his team slipped into the steam tunnel. They emerged in the dark, cavernous boiler room, the air thick with the smell of rust and stagnant water. They moved up through the building's guts, a deadly insurgency from below. The main battle erupted on the warehouse floor. It was a maelstrom of violence. The bikers fought with chains, knives, and fists, a disciplined force against a disorganized crew of hired guns. The clang of metal on metal and the guttural shouts of fighting men filled the vast space. Raze wasn't part of the main fray. He moved with a singular purpose, heading for the second-floor offices where he knew Silas would be. He found him there, attempting to gather cash and documents from a safe. Silas turned, his face calm, but his eyes held the cornered look of a rat. He held a sleek, semi-automatic pistol. "Vance," he said, his voice smooth. "I should have known you'd be too stupid to die." Quietly, "This is for the girl, Croft," Raze growled, circling him slowly. "You broke the rules." "There are no rules," Silas sneered, raising his pistol. But Raze was faster. He lunged, not at the gun, but at Silas's arm, slamming it against a metal filing cabinet. The gun clattered away. The fight was primal, brutal. Silas was wiry and quick, but Raze was a force of nature, fueled by a cold, righteous fury. He drove Silas back, blow after blow, until Silas stumbled back against the large office window. Raze grabbed him by the front of his expensive suit, hoisting him half off his feet. "You brought this on yourself," Raze snarled, his face inches from Silas's. Below them, the fighting had stopped. His brothers stood victorious amidst the wreckage, looking up. With a final, definitive roar, Raze shoved Silas backward. The window shattered, and Silas Croft, the ghost, plunged 2 stories to the concrete floor below. Justice, swift and absolute, had been served. The warehouse fell silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the victors and the distant wail of approaching sirens. The aftermath was as organized as the assault. By the time the first police cruisers arrived, the Hell's Angels were gone, melting back into the city's shadows as if they were never there. They left behind a scene of carnage, a dozen of Silas's men tied up and waiting for law enforcement, and Silas Croft's broken body as a clear, undeniable message to anyone who would dare to follow in his footsteps. Raze returned to the clubhouse just before dawn, the grime of the fight still on his knuckles, a deep exhaustion settling into his bones. The building was quiet. He walked up the stairs to the room where Isla was staying and knocked softly on the door. She opened it immediately, her face pale with worry. She hadn't slept at all. Her eyes searched his face, looking for answers for injuries. He had a fresh cut on his cheek and a darkening bruise on his jaw, but he was whole. "It's over," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Silas Croft won't be bothering you, or anyone else, ever again." He didn't offer details of the violence, and she didn't ask for them. She didn't need to. She could see it in the weariness of his posture, in the haunted look deep in his eyes. This was the price of her safety, a cost paid in blood and brutality. She stepped aside, letting him into the small room. He looked out a place there, a dark, powerful creature in a simple, quiet space. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling impossibly small, inadequate for the debt she now owed. He turned from the window to face her, the first rays of morning light catching the silver in his beard. "We pay our debts, Isla," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "You saved my life. My brothers and I, we were just returning the favor. This is what we do. We protect our own." In that moment, the line between monster and protector blurred into nothing. He wasn't just a biker. He was a guardian. He was the leader of a tribe that had claimed her, a family forged not by blood, but by a shared moment of violence and a selfless act of courage. She looked at this man, this king of an outlaw world, and saw not a criminal, but a redeemer. And in his eyes, he saw not a victim to be pitied, but a woman of incredible strength, a quiet artist who had faced down death for a stranger. A bond had been formed in the chaos, a connection that transcended their different worlds. The healing process would be long, for both the wound in her shoulder and the trauma in her soul, but as the sun rose over the city, Isla knew she would not be facing it alone. The roar of the engines was her new lullaby, and the fortress of leather and chrome was her new home. 6 months passed. The seasons turned, washing the city in the golden hues of autumn. The scar on Isla's shoulder faded from an angry red to a pale silver line, a permanent reminder of the day her life was irrevocably altered. But it was no longer a mark of trauma. It was a badge of honor, a symbol of her survival and rebirth. She never returned to her old apartment, to the quiet, solitary life she had once known. The clubhouse had become her home, and its members her family. She had found her place among the outlaws, not as a damsel in distress, but as a valued part of their world. She used her artistic talents to design new patches and tattoos, her keen eye for detail bringing the club's fierce spirit to life. She used her research skills to help Preacher manage the club's legitimate businesses and charity funds, finding discrepancies and opportunities that even his sharp eyes missed. She brought a quiet calm to their chaotic world, a touch of grace to their gritty existence. Today, the clubhouse was abuzz with a different kind of energy. It was the anniversary of Sarah's death, Ray's sister. Every year, the club held a memorial ride in her honor, a thundering procession to raise money for a shelter for abused women, the kind of place that might have saved her. Isla stood by a gleaming Harley-Davidson, not one of the club bikes, but her own. It was a smaller, sleeker model that Raze and Wrench had helped her rebuild from scratch. She ran a hand over the custom-painted gas tank, a beautiful, intricate design of a phoenix rising from flames. She wore a leather vest, but instead of the club's full patch, it had a simple, elegant one on the front. Property of the Brothers of Retribution, it wasn't a mark of ownership, but of belonging. Raze walked over, his eyes lingering on her for a moment. The hardness in his expression had softened over the months, replaced by a deep, protective affection. He no longer saw her as a debt to be repaid, but as the anchor that had settled the storm within him. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "I was born ready," she said, the confidence in her voice surprising even herself. She was no longer the timid girl who hid behind library books. She was a survivor, a warrior in her own right. As the engines roared to life, a symphony of defiance and freedom, Isla swung her leg over her bike. She was part of the procession now, one of the 150, riding not behind Raze, but beside him. They were a family of broken pieces, soldered together by loyalty and love, finding redemption on the open road. Their story proves that heroes are not defined by a uniform or a title, but by the choices they make in the darkest of moments. True protectors are often found in the most unlikely of places, wearing leather and ink instead of shining armor. If you believe in the power of brotherhood and the courage of survivors, share this story. Let the world know that even in the shadows, light can be found. And for every person facing their own battle, remember that you are not alone. There's a tribe out there waiting for you.